Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Zayin discusses the machlokes between Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman about a tumah b'tzibor. That is, if a public carbon is being brought for the entire tzibor, and the carbon is tamei or the kohen is tamei, there's tumah involved. So we said we know that you're allowed to bring that carbon. The machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes is: do we say that that's hutra? Rav Nachman says it's hutra, which means that the tumah is totally considered to be gone. It's totally off. There is no preference to try to do it with a tahar person or tahar carbon. The tumah is totally permitted. Rav Sheshes disagrees and he says no, it's dechuya. It's pushed off. We allow you to do it, but of course it's a very not lechatchila situation. It's not supposed to be like that, and therefore you should make every effort to try to avoid a tumah. But if you're stuck, then the tumah is allowed because it's a public carbon. Now, the karbanos about which we say that you're allowed to bring it b'tzibor, because tumah, either hutra or d'chuya, b'tzibor, are a public carbon. That means it's brought from the entire congregation with a fixed time. It has to be brought in this time. It can't have been brought earlier or later. And as we shall see, the Gemara will say it's something which is not eaten. That's where there is a machlokas, because something which is eaten, you can't eat it if it's tamei, even if we say that you're allowed to bring the carbon when it's tamei, but you definitely can't eat it when it's tamei, so there's for sure a preference to bring the carbon b'tahara if it's going to be eaten. So these are the three factors: that it's a public carbon, that it's a fixed time, and that it's not going to be eaten. The Gemara is going to bring a list of proofs one way or another to Rav Sheshes or to Rav Nachman, and the Gemara will push them all off by saying that they don't meet one or more of these requirements, or they weren't talking about a carbon tzibor at all. The Gemara will then move into another machlokes on a related subject near the end of the daf, and I'll get back to this machlokes in the first place. So first of all, let's try to bring a number of proofs to the question of is tumah hutra or dechuya. So the Gemara's first proof, Rav Sheshes brings it. He says, my proof is from a brisa which says that somebody is in the middle of bringing the carbon omer. That's a carbon, it's a mincha. A carbon minchas ha'omer, that's the barley that was brought for the carbon omer, which allowed grain to be eaten every year on the second day of Pesach, and it becomes tamei while he's bringing it. So the brisa says, look, if there's nothing else, then he's stuck, then there isn't any solution, he should just be quiet, because it's a public carbon. There isn't anything else you could do. However, if there are other materials around to bring this carbon mincha, then he should announce it to the chachamim and they'll bring a different one. So you see here clearly, even though it's a public carbon, still we want to try to do it b'tahara. So obviously toma is dechuya. Toma is only allowed if there's no other solution. If you could bring another one, then you should. So that's a proof to Rav Sheshes that tumah is only dechuya b'tzibor. So Rav Nachman says this is different. That carbon mincha is eaten, and I agree that any carbon mincha which is eaten, any carbon at all which is eaten, you prefer to have it be tahar. That way you could eat it. If it'll be tamei, you will be allowed to bring it. It'll be hutra, like I said, but you won't be able to eat it, and therefore I certainly agree that you preferably want to bring a eaten carbon b'tahara. Okay, the Gemara's next proof is a brisa which says that if you're bringing a carbon mincha which goes along with either parim, elim, or kvasim, that's oxen, rams, or sheep, and this carbon mincha becomes tamei under your hands, again, if you have no alternative, so don't say anything, it'll be permitted because it's b'tzibor. If, however, you can bring other ones, you can replace it, so then you should say and you should replace it. So again, we see you should replace it. Obviously, tumah is dechuya. It's not a preferable circumstance. You should try to avoid it if you could. Now, the assumption over here is that these parim, elim, and kvasim are the karbonos for the yantiv of Sukkos, which had parim, elim, and kvasim involved, and you're bringing here the carbon mincha for these karbonos. If that's the circumstance, so then these are all public karbonos which are not eaten and have a fixed time. So according to Rav Nachman, these should all be hutra. And obviously, from the fact that the brisa says you should replace it if you could, it's not hutra, it's dechuya. So the Gemara answers, and Nachman will tell you these are not the karbonos of Sukkos that we're talking about over here. It's three different karbonos that don't come together at all. Parim is oxen that's from the par that's brought if the congregation is involved in avodah zarah. They bring a carbon chatas. That does not have a fixed time. And therefore, I would agree that there is no tumah hutra b'tzibor there. And certainly you should try to replace it. Elim is talking about the aisle that's brought by Aaron. That's a private carbon. That's not a public carbon at all. I would certainly agree that there is no hutra there. And kvasim is talking about the sheep that comes with the carbon omer, and that, of course, has to be eaten like the carbon omer, and therefore I agree that since it's something that you eat, tuma is not hutra there. You want to try to do it b'tahara. Okay. Next, the Gemara brings a brisa that says that the tzitz is miratza. We know that the halacha is that if the Kohen Hagadol is wearing the tzitz, the special part of the big day kahuna which he wore on his forehead, the tzitz takes off the problem of tumah. It allows the carbon to be brought b'tumah, or b'diavad, if a carbon is brought b'tumah, it makes it okay. Now, the Gemara goes with the understanding that if you say that a public carbon is hutra, it's totally mutter, you wouldn't need the tzitz to be meratzeh. The tzitz is necessarily perhaps for other karbanos, which are not hutra, or for a carbon yachid, or maybe a carbon which isn't a fixed time, or whatever it is. But if you have a situation where the tzitz is, if you have a situation where you have tumah hutra, but see, like if Nachman says it's totally permitted, why should you need the tzitz? So the Gemara brings a brisa. The Brisa says, what is the tzitz miratza? What does the tzitz help the tumah problem for? It helps for putting the blood on the mizbeach, or for putting meat on the mizbeach, or for putting chaylev on the mizbeach. And if any of these things became tamei, and you put it on the mizbeach, whether it became tamei and you put it on the mizbeach b'shaygig, by mistake, b'mezin, on purpose, or ba'aynis, whether you couldn't help it, or baratzin, or you intentionally knew what was happening, or if it's a carbon yachid, or if it's a carbon tzibor. Either of these things, a public carbon or a private carbon, any of these things, the tzitz is miratza. So Gemara says it's a clear proof that even in a carbon tzibor, tuma is only dechuya, and that's why you need the tzitz to take off the tuma problem. According to Rav Nachman, that tuma is hutra b'tzibor, so why would I need the tzitz? So Gemara answers, Rav Nachman will say, no, the tzitz over here is only needed for the yachid part of these. The Brisa is telling you that all these things you're allowed to bring. The tzitz is needed not for everything on the list. The tzitz is needed for the things on the list which don't have heter on their own, and therefore it's going on the carbon yachid, it's not going on the carbon tzibur. That's Rav Nachman's first answer. Rav Nachman's second answer is that it's going on a carbon tzibur which doesn't have a fixed time. There, I agree that the tzitz is needed, because I hold that I don't say hutra. I only say hutra on something that has a fixed time, as I said earlier. The Gemara now brings another proof, also from the topic of the tzitz taking off the iser of karbonos. And here we have a brisa that says as follows. The brisa says that the pasuk describing Aaron wearing the tzitz says, "V'nasa Aaron es avon hakachim." The tzitz will take off; it'll carry the avera of karbonos. Which avera is this referring to? Says the brisa. So the brisa says maybe it's talking about the iser of a pigul. That's where the kohen has in mind when he's doing the avoda of the carbon, has in mind to eat it in the wrong time or in the wrong place. Either of these two things, maybe that's the avera that the tzitz takes off. So the Brisa says it can't be, because the tzitz doesn't take off that avera. Like the pasuk says, lo ye ratzeh, lo ye chashev. Wrong place, lo ye ratzeh. Wrong time, lo ye chashev. So it's not what it's referring to. So the Brisa continues and it says, no, it's referring to the iser of tumah. The tzitz takes off the iser of tumah. Why does it take off that iser? Because that's a weak iser. How do you see it's weak? Because it's hutra b'tzibor. The tzibor are allowed to bring, it's totally mutter to bring a carbon b'tzibor if it's tameh. So you see, therefore, that the tzitz could take off the iser. Now, the tzitz obviously then is referring to taking off the iser on a carbon yachid. Well, this is a proof to Rav Nachman and against Rav Sheshes, because it says hutra b'tzibor. It says clearly that the tumah is hutra b'tzibor. It is totally permitted, and the tzitz apparently seems to be only used for a carbon yachid. So Gemara says, you're right, this Tana does hold like Rav Nachman, it's a good proof. However, I'll show you that there's another Tana that holds like Rav Sheshes, and that it's really machlokes Tanaim, whether Tumah is Hutra or Dechuya B'tzibor. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says it's in a different machlokes, and the conversation between two Tanaim about that machlokes will show that they clearly also argue about whether Tumah is Hutra or Dechuya. What's that machlokes? That machlokes is about where does the tzitz have to be in order to deal with the Isra of Tumah on Karbanos. According to Rabbi Shimon, it could be anywhere. The Kohen Gadol does not have to be wearing it. It could be holding it. It could be in the bag. The tzitz, the existence of the tzitz around, takes off the iser of tumah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the Kohen has to be wearing it. If he's not wearing it, it doesn't work. So the Gemara brings a brisa where the conversation between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda is discussed, and Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Shimon says, I have a clear proof that the Kohen doesn't have to be wearing it, because on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol doesn't wear the tzitz when he goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and not allowed to wear anything gold in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Yet, we know that it does take off, the tzitz does take off tumah that might occur in the avoda of Yom HaKippur. So Rabbi Yehuda says that's different. That's a public carbon, and tumah hutra b'tzibor. You don't need the tzitz for that. The tzitz only works if it's being worn. There you don't need the tzitz. That's why the tumah is taken off even if it's not being worn. So Gemara says, so what would Reb Shimon respond to that? Obviously Reb Shimon holds that there is no tumah hutra there. You do need the tzitz for Yom Kippur. You don't say that it's gone and it's hutra because it's a public carbon. Obviously then there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon whether tumah is hutra b'tzibor or tumah is only dechuya b'tzibor. Okay, now the Gemara says, let's go deeper into this machlokes as to whether the tzitz has to be worn or it could just be held or somewhere else in order to work to take off tumah problems in a situation where you don't have hutra otherwise. So Abaye says their machlokes is only if the tzitz is there, it's functional, but it's hanging on a hook or something. If it's broken or if it's not functional, then there is no machlokes. Everybody will agree that the tzitz does not work. Now, what's the machlokes based on? So it's based on the psukim. The pasuk describing the tzitz says as follows. It says, "V'haya metzach Aaron." It should be on Aaron's forehead. V'nas Aaron esavon hakachim, and then Aaron will take off the iser. So you see, says Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be al metzach Aaron in order to be v'nasa esavon. It has to be on his forehead in order to take the iser off. That's his source. Rabbi Shimon says, however, no, the Kohen doesn't have to be wearing it on his forehead. It works even if he's not wearing it. What's my source? Later on in the same pasuk, it says, "V'hayam mitzchol tamid l'ratzon lehem lifnei Hashem." It should be on his forehead all the time. L'ratzon to take off the yisur to bring ritzo. It says Rabbi Shimon, it has to be on his forehead all the time. What's about when he needs to go to the bathroom? What's about when he needs to sleep? Can't be on his forehead all the time. The pasuk tamid must mean to say that it works tamid. It's always tamid l'ratzon. It always constantly brings ritzo, even if it's not on his forehead at the time. It's always okay. All right, the Gemara says, how's Rabbi Yehuda going to deal with that? It does say tamid, and he can't be wearing it all the time. So it means that he always has to be thinking about it. When he's wearing it, he has to have it tamid in his mind, and that's similar to a statement of Rabbi Bar Avuna, who said that if somebody has to constantly keep his hand and his thoughts on his tefillin, because since he has to always be thinking about the tzitz, the Kohen Gadol has to always be thinking about the tzitz, and the tzitz only has one name of Hashem in it, a person certainly always has to be thinking about the tefillin, which have many names of Hashem in it, all the...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.